everyone, and thank you for joining our session on the Great Mughals, Kingship in the Histories of Babur, Akbar, and Jahangir. The purpose of the panel is to explore how these three early Mughal rulers conceptualized and practiced kingship, framing the discussion through the written histories of their reigns. In 1494, at the age of 12, the Timurid princeling Zahiruddin Babur inherited his father's holdings in and around the Fergana Valley, an area steeped in Timurid regional, political, and cultural traditions. Descendant from both the great Central Asian conqueror and founder of empire, Timur, and the legendary Mongol ruler and warlord, Genghis Khan, Babur, at a young age, entered into the regional competition for power, taking place amongst other Timurid princes and the Uzbeks. Intent on furthering his territorial ambitions, he aimed to take Samarkand, Timur's great capital city, but was unable to fully do so and so moved south, taking Kabul in 1504. From there, he eventually looked east to Al-Hind, a move predicated on Timur's invasion of the region in 1398. After various military encounters in North India, in 1526, Babur defeated the armies of Ibrahim Lodi, the Delhi Sultan, at the Battle of Panipat. In doing so, Babur laid claim to the territory of the Delhi Sultanate in North India, establishing the foundation of what would become one of the most luxurious, powerful empires of the early modern era. Babur ruled over his new lands for only 4 years before his death in 1530, bequeathing to his eldest son, Humayun, his newest and most important territory in Al-Hind. Like his father, Humayun's total time as ruler was relatively short-lived. He had a 10-year reign, followed by a 15-year period where he was supplanted by one of his father's generals, and then he had 1 more year on the Mughal throne after retaking his kingdom. When he died, he was succeeded by his 13-year-old son, Akbar. It was under Akbar, who reigned from 1556 to 1605, a period of 49 years, that the Mughals' territory was firmly established as a coherent and unified political entity, and that a true empire emerged. Akbar was succeeded by his son Salim, who took the regnal title of Jahangir, meaning the world Caesar, on his accession. His reign from 1605 to 1627 saw a continuation of the political power established by his father, but an increase in the display of luxury and wealth. From the time the empire was established as a political and military hegemony during Akbar's reign, tales of its fabled wealth beyond its borders and attracted to it an abundance of visitors, diplomats, and adventurers from Europe and Asia alike, each wanting to take advantage of perceived economic opportunities for both themselves and their countries. The magnificence that we today associate with the first half of the Mughal Empire was solidified and projected by Jahangir, in part due to his awareness of the importance of visual perception. He was responsible for the creation of a visual language of power, which, from his reign onwards, permeated Mughal courtly culture and artistic production. Coming back to the theme of our session, when we use the term kingship, what do we mean? In general terms, we can say that this refers to the position of being king, the skills necessary to be king, or the philosophy of rule that the king aspired to or practiced. In the Mughal context, it is this last part of the definition which comes to the fore. What was their philosophy of rule? What made a good king, and how could this be projected? What was of importance for establishing their basis for rule and confirming their dynasty in this position? Babur existed very much within the milieu of Timurid courtly practice and ritual, a fact which had an important effect upon his successors. The Timurid heritage of the Mughals was of the utmost importance, providing not only dynastic legitimacy for their rule, but also an ideal of courtly culture and artistic production and patronage that should be aspired to. This Timurid link was very clearly on display in Humayun's commission, Princes of the House of Timur, a large painting on cloth which pictured him with his Timurid ancestors, reflecting the immediate importance of dynastic heritage and its link with legitimacy. Akbar was then recipient of these teachings and reminiscences and translated into Persian important family histories, including the Chingizname, Timurname, and Baburname. And he had illustrated versions of these commissions. Jahangir was also deeply invested in this heritage and also reflected on it in his autobiography and in much of the material culture he commissioned. An important aspect of Mughal courtly culture was the visual, which is to say that there was a strong projection of visual identity associated with kingship. This was not only dependent on their Timurid heritage, but was also quickly infused with more ancient Persian notions that linked kingship with divine effulgence, such as the concept of far, a light emanating from the ruler to signify his divine right to rule. During Jahangir's reign, this was visualized through the incorporation of the halo into imperial portraits, as seen in this genealogical tree where the halo is present around Jahangir's head. It was during Akbar's reign that a clear narrative of divine kingship was created and dispersed. Divine kingship in this context does not mean that Akbar considered himself to be divine, but rather that he and his line were divinely ordained to rule. This is evident in passages and themes presented in the Akbarname, his official court history, and the Ayani Akbari, an extensive tome on the administration of his empire, both written by Akbar's close friend and biographer, Abul Fazl. And while under Akbar this concept of imperial ideology was formulated, it was Jahangir who visualized concepts of divine kingship, but also sacred kingship and Solomonic kingship. To frame the discussion today, the concepts of kingship and sovereignty, as practiced by Babur, Akbar, and Jahangir, will be explored through their court histories, the Baburname, Akbarname, and Jahangirname. Babur's and Jahangir's are autobiographical. Both rulers wrote their own history in a more relaxed manner, almost as if writing a journal. These are remarkable resources for several reasons, one of which is how much their individual personalities, their flaws, their misgivings, their triumphs, all of these are projected onto the page. And we're also given the opportunity to see how they themselves approached the idea of ruling, what was important to them, and what they considered of note. And they're truly remarkable documents. The Akbarname, also exceptionally remarkable, is on the other hand written by Abul Fazl and is a much more formal, extravagantly ceremonious history of Akbar's reign. We see in it ideas and concepts which become effectively codified within Mughal imperial ideology, including the idea of sacred kingship and divine kingship. And I would now like to formally introduce our panel and the specialists who will share their insights into how Babur, Akbar, and Jahangir formulated and practiced kingship during their reigns and how this was reflected in their court histories. My name is Dr. Mehreen Chida-Razvi, and I'll be moderating this session. I'm the Deputy Curator of the Nasir-D Khalili Collection of Islamic Art and a Mughal art historian specializing in the reign of Jahangir. We have with us as well Professor Stephen Dale, who will be speaking on kingship in the Baburname. Stephen is an emeritus professor of South Asian and Islamic history and distinguished university scholar at The Ohio State University. He's published several biographies of Babur, most recently with Cambridge University Press in 2018. And he's also published on the early modern Muslim empires of the Ottomans, Safavids, and Mughals. Additionally, he's written a wonderful study on Ibn Khaldun titled The Orange Trees of Marrakesh, published in 2015. We have with us as well Susan Stronge, who will speak on concepts of kingship presented in the Akbarname. Sue is a senior curator in the Asian department of the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. Her main research focuses on the arts of the Mughals under Akbar, Jahangir, and Shah Jahan, and her books include Painting for the Mughal Emperor, published in 2002, Made for Mughal Emperors, published in 2010, and Bejeweled Treasures, the Albani collection, published in 2015. And she's currently working on a book about the V&A Akbarname. And we have with us as well Dr. Lisa Balabanlilar, who will be speaking on Jahangir's notions of kingship through the Jahangirname. Lisa is an associate professor of history at Rice University in Houston, Texas, where she also serves as chair of the Department of Transnational Asian Studies, and she's the director of the Chow Center for Asian Studies. Her first book Imperial Identity in the Mughal Empire, published in 2012, examines political identity and heritage in the Mughal dynasty. Her latest book, The Emperor Jahangir, Power and Kingship in Mughal India, is a biography of the emperor and came out last April, and a paperback version of it will be coming out shortly. I'm delighted to welcome you all and thank you all for your participation in the session today. For our audience, we'll now hear from our panelists in turn, who will speak for 10 minutes each, at the end of which we'll have a 20-minute discussion. So I would first like to welcome Stephen to discuss concepts of kingship in the Baburnameh.
Thank you for the invitation. It's wonderful to see everyone else and to be able to talk about a subject which is an endless fascination. I'd like to say a couple things at the beginning, and that is with the current political situation in South Asia, there is this constant or recurring vision of Babur either as a barbarian conqueror from Central Asia or as a religious fanatic, or both sometimes. And in a recent trip I had about a year ago to India, I realized that in fact that there's a widespread antipathy towards Babur and indeed towards the Mughals. But let me go back to talking about kingship, or what he imagined himself to be doing, and what his view of the kind of kingship he imagined to be establishing in India. The most important aspect of this, of course, is that, as you indicated at the beginning, that Babur was self-consciously a Timurid, that is to say, a descendant of Timur, the second of these great Central Asian conquerors, but also descended from Genghis Khan. But his identity was always as a Timurid or as a Turk. And his inheritance of political ideology really comes out of the background of the later Timurid period, which hardly resembles the earlier period in which, when Timur died in 1405. By the time that Babur inherited this little appanage in the Fergana Valley, the Timurids had evolved to become almost like city-states, rulers of city-states in Central Asia, Samarkand, or Samarkand being the most important of these. And I should say, if understanding what Babur saw in the combination of kingship, you have to read his description of his father, which is this interesting combination of a very minor princely state in the Fergana Valley, which is sometimes seen, of course, totally as the back of beyond, absolutely in the middle of nowhere. But in fact is in the middle of the Silk Road, connecting China to the west. And his father had this very minor court, which included, first of all, of course, an identity as a Hanafi Sunni Muslim, as a disciple of the Naqshbandi Sufi order, as someone who was literate in Persian as well as in Turki, Chagatai Turkish, and whose vision of rule was not that of the draconian policies of Timur himself, but was the kind of Perso-Islamic kingship in Central Asia. And so I think this is the best way to understand what's going on, because by the end of the 15th century, the Mughals have become these highly cultured group of Hanafi Sunni Muslims who had absorbed Perso-Islamic culture to an enormously high degree. So even Babur's father, who never pretended to be a poet, nonetheless could read Ferdowsi or Sadi or Hafez happily. In terms of Babur's own vision of kingship, I think you have to say that basically it's a kind of traditional late Timurid state. That is to say, when he wanted to establish a state in Samarkand, as did all of the other Timurids, of course, who were fighting for supremacy at that time, because Samarkand was, of course, the center of Timur's empire, the headquarters, the capital of Timur's empire. Having lost out, of course, in the conflict with his relatives, and more particularly with the Uzbeks, he is, as was described, forced out of Central Asia and winding up in Kabul, which had been, again, another appanage of the Timurids left over from Timur's invasion in 1398. I think the best understanding of what he was up to is, first of all, to emphasize that his invasion of India was a dynastic invasion. That is to say, it's dynastic imperialism. It's not religious imperialism or barbarian imperialism in the case of someone like Timur. It was dynastic imperialism. That is to say, Babur was desperately looking for a place to establish an effective Timurid state. And as he said many times when talking about Afghanistan, that Afghanistan wasn't worth the trouble. Right? First of all, it was too poor and it was too much conflict. And in fact, one of the areas in which Osama bin Laden took refuge after the Americans invaded Afghanistan was the district in which Babur said was absolutely hopeless to try to establish precedence. So first of all, just to emphasize, this is a dynastic invasion. And what Babur wanted for himself was a secure and wealthy state in which to establish a new Timurid kingdom. And it really is reflected in a way of one of the historians of Shah Jahan, who later described Shah Jahan's, the whole situation around Agra as a civilized and comfortable kingdom. Right? So what did Babur want out of invading India? He wanted a civilized and comfortable kingdom, which would be ruled by, no doubt, a Timurid who was also a Hanafi Sunni Muslim, and who would continue a kind of traditional late 15th century rule, a rule in which the ulama would be patronized, no doubt, in which Islamic institutions would be respected, but essentially a rule of Timurids and Chingizids that had been simply exported from Central Asia to India. And so, of course, Babur at one point, when he's in Kabul, declares himself the Padshah, that is to say, invoking the traditional Iranian title, which was more in his imagination than in reality at that particular time. But nonetheless, it's clear that the kind of kingship that he imagined himself establishing was a very non-revolutionary kind of traditional late 15th century Timurid kingship, in which you would have all the elements that you could see in his father's court magnified on a very large scale. Of course, the other thing that Mehreen was alluded to is that, of course, why did Babur invade India and not somewhere else? Of course, the answer is, of course, he couldn't go anywhere else. That is, he'd been thrown out of Central Asia by the Uzbeks. The Safavids had consolidated India and Iran, and it wasn't worth the trouble of subjugating Afghanistan. Apart from that problem, of course, was the attraction of India, that is the fabulous wealth of South Asia. And so another aspect of all of this is simply to see Babur as one of the later succession of many of the invaders who come in to India from Central Asia or Iran for the very good reason that it's extraordinarily wealthy territory. And as many of you know, in Babur's memoirs, he really didn't like India at all, right? He didn't like the environment, he didn't like the climate, but he said, I'd like one thing about India, that is to say, it's full of gold and silver. Right? So the goal, it seems to me, it was a very traditional, non-revolutionary kind of a new version or magnification of what he had known in Central Asia. And so he would be ruling as a Timurid, no doubt ruling as a Muslim, but primarily as a Timurid who was a Muslim, and would be patronizing personal Islamic culture and showing respect, especially for the Sufi silsilas, especially the Naqshbandi, and he of course also inherited the respect for the Chishti silsila, which had already established in India. So we have those elements of the Timurid state established in India. What you do not have, of course, what you're also alluding to, is an idea of sacred kingship. Nowhere in the Baburnama or in any of his poetry does he present himself as a sacred figure. Nowhere. right? He simply presents himself as a Timur who's shopping around for a territory in which to establish a new Timur kingdom. Right? And so his allusions to religion in the Balabanlinar are actually very few. I mean, he talks about the prayers. He often records what he's doing during the daytime, as whether it's before or after a certain kind of prayer. And so there's that kind of thing. But he almost never, in fact, even describes himself going into a mosque and praying. One of the few times he alludes to this, in fact, is when he's an augur, and he said he wasn't feeling well, so he couldn't go up to the mosque, and so he prayed inside the palace. So I think if you think of things in that context, but you really do have to distinguish between what Babur represented and what Akbar and Jahangir later represented, because it's a very different political world in terms of kingship. Babur never refers to the Sasanian Far, which you alluded to, Mehreen. It's a traditional dynastic kingship with those elements that he had known from his father's court in this minor appanage in the Fergana Valley. And I think I'll leave it there and allow the rest of you to.
No, that was great. Thank you so much. It's such a fascinating insight, because, as you say, Babur does have this perception about him, especially within India and South Asia today. But when we talk about these ideas of kingship, it is quite far removed, I think, from these popular conceptions of what the Mughals thought about. So some really interesting things for us to come back to in the discussion. I would now like to bring in Sue, who is going to speak to us about kingship in the Akbarname.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me to this panel. I just wish we were all together in the same room and we could discuss things more intimately with two people whose work I admire enormously, Stephen and Lisa. I'm talking about the Akbarnama in the V&A. There's a tendency in art history to talk about Mughal painting as if these works exist independently, unconnected to any text. Though in the period covered by our panel, of course, they all belong to manuscripts or albums. And this has happened partly because many of the paintings now in museums actually do now exist only as separate entities. They've long since been removed from intact manuscripts. And it's an unfortunate phenomenon that when these illustrated volumes have come into the hands of dealers, there's a very high risk of them being broken up because the dealer gets less money for selling a single volume than if the paintings are cut out and sold individually, and the text then often disappears. Even when the manuscript or album is complete in a museum or library, it's often very difficult to see all its paintings and how they relate to the text, what visual rhythms may be set up, what events are illustrated or not illustrated. And that's why digital photography and the mass availability of online resources is such a game changer. But in this short presentation, I'd like to look at the incomplete but nevertheless substantial part of the illustrated manuscript in the V&A, the Akbarnama, the history of Akbar's reign, written obviously in Persian, which by now was the administrative language of the empire, as well as the cultural language of the elite that Stephen just talked about. The V&A copy was done between 1590 and 1595 and has 116 contemporary paintings in it. The history is so important that a scholarly edited Persian text of the original history that was commissioned by Akbar had been published by the late 19th century with an English translation published over several decades in the early 20th century. And there's currently a bilingual Persian-English edition being done by Wheeler Thaxton, published in multiple volumes by the Murti Classical Library of India. And in total, these texts allow us to interpret details of the depiction of royalty, specifically the emperor, in the V&A manuscript paintings, even before we look at the particular episodes that are illustrated and why they may have been chosen. The third part of this huge history, the Ayani Akbari or Regulations of Akbar that Mehreen mentioned, contains an enormous amount of information, including a list of leading artists of the time, and the list relates precisely to these names at the bottom of each page, written in red by a contemporary librarian, here saying who composed the painting, who did the painting, and here who did the portraits, which is quite unusual to have the assigned portrait artist. But this list relates precisely to the names written on the V&A Akbarnama paintings, proving that these pages were intended for the emperor. The Ayani Akbari also has a section on the emblems of royalty that are depicted in the Akbarnama. And the first in the list is the throne, which isn't exactly a surprising attribute of kingship. Here we see Akbar on his golden throne. The second is the parasol, sometimes joined to the throne as a canopy, though a canopy might take its place. And the next one is something called the aftab-gir, or sunshade, which we see here, carried over the head of the emperor. And all these are the prerogative of the king alone. Now, Abul Fazl in the Ayani Akbari also says that when the king rides out, he's followed here by servants carrying an array of standards and insignia, all wrapped in scarlet cloth that itself indicates royalty. And I believe this comes directly from the Timurid tradition, but perhaps Stephen can talk about that in the discussion later. But here we see Akbar moving from one royal city to another, with the traveling throne here on the boat, indicating how crucial this was to a public manifestation of kingship. And you can also see his attendants trying desperately to keep their balance, carrying these imperial standards in the boats that accompany him. And also present on the left, you may be able to see the musicians who are carrying the instruments that are also part of the paraphernalia of royalty. When we look at a manuscript done for Akbar personally, we see how the role of the emperor as the divinely appointed ruler is subtly woven into the way that events are presented, and in the V&A manuscript, how they're chosen for illustration. Now, the V&A manuscript was bought by the museum in 1896 from the widow of a British officer of the East India Company. And it was described at the time as very, very much damaged, though that is quite an exaggeration. I think the text pages have more damage than the paintings. But the crucial thing is that the folios weren't bound, they were very loosely stitched together. And in 1896, the museum authorities decided to separate the paintings so that they could be mounted and framed and displayed on the wall, as most museums still do with Mughal paintings. The text of the manuscript is still in the V&A, but it begins in 1596 when Akbar was traveling from the Punjab, where he'd spent some time in Lahore, to Agra, and it ends abruptly in the middle of 1577. The following pages are all missing. Abul Fazl was one of the leading intellectuals of the court, and he was, as Mehreen said, a close friend of the emperor. His account of the reign is meticulously researched, and the events he describes are historically accurate. But he also presents the events of the reign from a very specific perspective. Wheeler Thaxton, in his introduction to the Akbarnama, notes Abul Fazl portrays Akbar as the ideal monarch, drawing from the models of both ancient Iranian kingship and the perfect man in Sufism. And the events chosen to illustrate the history, almost always, but not without exception, significant in themselves, often mark perceived stages in the evolution towards Akbar's essential role, to dispense justice and to create harmony, order, and regularity across his empire. And the historian constantly emphasizes how gradual the process was. At the point where Akbar was traveling by boat to Agra, the author says he was still hidden behind a veil of inattentiveness to physical and spiritual rule. This may be simply an expression of Akbar's youth. The illustrations to the text, however, often mark the stages of the emergence from behind this veil so that he can reveal his world illuminating spiritual beauty. And the very first painting in the V&A sequence is part of this notion. It depicts an event that took place in 1560 when Akbar was about 18. And Abul Fazl explains that capturing cheetahs was the most remarkable of all the arts of the hunt in Hindustan. The animals had to be lured into specially dug deep pits without being injured and were then tamed to be used in hunting. And this incident was the first time Akbar had ever seen at first hand this particular form of hunting, and his close participation is emphasized by the way that he crouches down to hold the cheetah's head. But it's also one of several hunting scenes in the Akbarnama, all underlining the emperor as the royal hunter, a standard theme of kingship within the Iranian tradition. Given the context of recent events, this particular image is particularly significant. Abul Fazl emphasizes that Akbar has, with divine assistance, just freed himself from a major existential threat of rebellion and was now free to go to Agra to carry out one of the essential roles of kings, the dispensation of justice. The hunt took place at the beginning of the fifth year of Akbar's reign, which was a year of particularly good fortune, ending with a major celebration. This was the event depicted here, the marriage of a son of Maham Anaga, whose position at court was quite remarkable. She had been Akbar's wet nurse, this is her here, and she was now, according to Abul Fazl, overseeing all administrative and fiscal affairs, and her importance is underlined in the painting by the fact that she's given the rare privilege of being allowed to sit in the presence of the emperor. Akbar has the outward signs of kingship, the servants holding these emblems of royalty and the throne, but he is not yet the spiritual authority that would come later, according to the historian. But as he grew older, he began to control the various court factions, and events in the Akbarnama are increasingly linked to principles emphasized by Abul Fazl as marking the spiritual evolution of the emperor. And the fate of Maham Anaga's second son illustrates this perfectly. After various acts of near rebellion, Adam Khan burst into the palace at night with a companion who murdered one of Akbar's most senior nobles, and you can see his body here in the lower left. Akbar heard the commotion, rushed out of the women's quarters, sword in hand, and got his blow in against Adam Khan first. Akbar then ordered a capital punishment for this unforgivable offense, and Adam Khan was thrown from the parapet to his death here. Abul Fazl describes the occasion as a turning point. It was an incident that demonstrated more than anything his role as a supreme dispenser of justice, as well as of the spiritual and physical greatness of the Lord of the world, he describes him, who would guide the ignorant onto the path of devotion with his lamp of knowledge. And the historian engages in a certain amount of hyperbole. He claims that as a result of this manifestation of the imperial justice, tyrants now disappeared into obscurity and the oppressed flourished. In 1565, construction began on the replacement of the old decaying fort at Agra with a new one that would be suitably magnificent, but would also give better protection. Something like this was obviously worth including as an illustration to this text. But Abul Fazl describes the unfolding of the events of the reign as being predetermined. The accomplishment of each aspect of kingship had its proper time. And this current time was that for building the fortress that would be stable as the basis of this dynasty's fortune and built with the assistance of the architect of good fortune, God. When Akbar gave orders for his new city to be built at the village of Sikri a few years later in 1571, he renamed it Fatehpur, and the emperor in Abul Fazl's text is described as the architect of the physical and spiritual world. Just as he orders the foundations of physical buildings to be laid, he simultaneously lays out the foundations of justice in his realms, and so the construction of both cities is also a metaphor. So Abul Fazl throughout the text is presenting Akbar as the latest and most perfect manifestation of the divine light that had infused Alankawa, the remote ancestress of both Genghis Khan and Timur, and continued hidden in the lineage for many generations until it attained perfection and was revealed in the person of Akbar, according to Wheeler Thaxton's introduction. And so I'll finish there, but I think I should conclude by just saying that all the images that I've shown can be downloaded from the V&A website from Search the Collections. Thank you.
Wonderful, Sue. Thank you so much. That was, yeah, fascinating. And it's so interesting to see how we have already, from Babur to Akbar, seeing this development of ideas of kingship and how they're becoming expressed. And fascinating how you can see it as the Akbarname progresses, the way that Abul Fazl is writing about kingship in association with Akbar progresses with time. So it seems there's this very clear narrative which is being created and expressed. Thank you so much. And now we come to Lisa, who is going to speak to us about kingship within the Jahangirname.
Thank you so much, Mehreen. It's such a pleasure to be here, at least virtually, in particular with these wonderful scholars. So thank you so much for inviting me and us. So I've lived with Jahangir for a long time. And it's always seemed to me that Jahangir's vision of kingship, how kingship is enacted, how it's negotiated, the extent of its reach, its cosmic meaning, all of it is derived really from the legacies of the past, which is why framing it around Babur and Akbar is so critical. There's nothing incredibly unique or original about Jahangir's vision other than the way he packages it. And that's why he can't be examined apart from the powerful legacies of his predecessors. So while he's clearly a very talented man and extraordinarily delicately sensitive to the natural world and the arts, I would not frame him as a creative genius in the way that we think of Akbar and even Babur at times. His success in kingship was in his ability to absorb the lessons of his predecessors. And throughout his life, throughout his reign, these two, Babur and Akbar in particular, were his models and his inspiration. Of course, his distant ancestors, as Stephen has commented, Genghis Khan and Timur had profound legacies in this dynasty, and they had extraordinary value for Jahangir as markers of legitimacy, as justifications for rule. He referenced them regularly. But for Jahangir, it was particularly these two, Babur and Akbar, great-grandfather and father, who offered the most direct and meaningful prototypes for kingship, who became his exemplars, his archetypes, not just embodying kingship, but performing kingship. When Jahangir takes the throne and refers to Akbar, his father, as his guide and his symbolic qibla, he's not being hyperbolic. Although his relationship with his father had been a fraught mixture of resentment, rivalry, and to be honest, a really passionate admiration, you can imagine the extraordinary burden of being the eldest son of Akbar. Famously, Jahangir responded to that by first becoming an alcoholic and then becoming a rebel. It's always a good response to powerful parenting. And even before his rebellion, he'd been a provocateur at the royal court for years, deliberately drawing support away from his father where he could from a varied host of dissatisfied and disaffected outsiders. Eventually, in 1599, he would establish an independent counter court in Allahabad, where he declared himself Padshah, still using, of course, the Persian title for king. He has the khutbah read in his name. He has coins minted in his name, and he is able to offer patronage to his supporters. He takes on the full responsibility of kingship. So it's a little difficult then to square that with his admiration for Akbar. But when Akbar died in 1605, only very shortly after a still very delicate and fragile reunion had brought Jahangir's open rebellion to a close, Jahangir expressed unreserved pride in his father, his personal and his political legacies. And from the very beginning of his reign, and this really surprised a lot of the nobility, of course, but at the beginning of his reign, Jahangir immediately pivoted to an unequivocal policy of public devotion and emulation of Akbar, what I describe as a political strategy of filial piety. And yes, it's all very politically expedient because Akbar's policies were generally very popular. But having read Jahangirnama so closely over so many years, it's clear that to me that Jahangir's admiration for Akbar went beyond mere rhetoric. He expresses sincere reverence, and I think it took the death of the king, the death of Akbar, to allow Jahangir to feel and to publicly demonstrate his admiration and affection. Which isn't to say he's a complete acolyte. Of course, he's highly competitive. He's a deeply insecure man, there's no doubt. So his praise for Akbar is always tempered with this kind of competitive edge. And he is the same way with his own son, Khurram, who would become his successor, Shah Jahan. Every time he expresses paternal pride, he additionally has to add this success of his own to counterbalance the power of his father and his son. But even implied criticism is really rare through Jahangir's reign. And Jahangir takes this as an opportunity for reputational rehabilitation. So this isn't only true for his recorded public statements, but of course his memoir, which is such a critical part of the whole Jahangir narrative. It's filled with glowing praise for Akbar. He struggled a bit to explain his own rebellion, but he even found a way to defend his arranged assassination of his father's best friend and amanuensis, Abul Fazl, and claims that Abul Fazl was in fact actively undermining their relationship, and that the assassination had a higher purpose in it, that it allowed Akbar and Jahangir to resolve their mutual mistrust and animosity. So just a few years later, when his own rebellious older son, Khusrau, was defeated, Jahangir would take the moment to ruminate on kingship, his own inheritance, his earlier disloyalty to Akbar. He claimed he'd been advised by short-sighted men. He proudly said that he used his own intelligence and his own knowledge to ultimately reject the advice of the weak-minded people who encouraged insurrection. And he says his surrender, his return to his father, and his public homage to Akbar was an act of humility that gave him what he deserved, which was the throne. And yet, having taken the throne, Jahangir's clearly feeling outmatched. We've seen Akbar and Abul Fazl toying with these ideas of sacred kingship, but Jahangir will claim them very rarely and very inconsistently. And even his participation in Akbar's so-called sacred cult became very quickly much more pragmatic than idealistic. Much more about tying young noblemen to him in bonds of fealty rather than making any divine claims. It's my sense that Jahangir's own flaws, his own messiness, were so obvious even to himself that he could never quite comfortably pretend to be of Akbar's ilk. And he never quite comfortably could share his father's claims. And the only ways in which these displays of divinity were really consistently realized were in the paintings of his period. Sue showed us a few of those amazing images of the so-called allegorical paintings. And this is really the only place where Jahangir's effort to be the Insan Kamil, the arbiter of all, this is the only place where they're comfortably expressed. And it seems to me that part of this is perhaps that the performance is static in these paintings. It's a moment frozen in time. He doesn't have to sustain a certain behavior for any length of time. We have records of his behavior in his royal court, even when he's attempting to emulate his father's sacred court. And the bystanders describe him as steadily getting drunk through the evening and falling asleep on the throne pretty regularly. I think this would indicate that his drunkenness and his behaviors at the Majlis preclude any sustained pretense at sacred kingship. So how much better to do that, but in a static and magnificent painting filled with the iconographies of power. So it's in the shadow of Akbar that Jahangir then turns to the other great family model, his great-grandfather Babur. And I think he's drawn to Babur from the very beginning of his reign. He describes coming to Kabul a few years into his inheritance and reading Babur's memoir in the original Turki. And keeping in mind that Babur's memoirs not only kind of heightens recognition of the individual within this Timurid Mughal milieu, but it also reinforces the value of his self-representation, right? This is really unusual for the period. And it's meaningful for Jahangir. He has tons of baggage as a former rebel, as a known alcoholic, as an opium user. So while Akbar had increasingly claimed divinity on a certain level, it's contested, Babur offers Jahangir a model of kingship that is deeply human. Akbar's extraordinary abstemiousness, his frugality, that could all be replaced by Babur's model, which is that of a very successful empire builder ultimately, and a sensitive aesthete and a poet. But he regularly falls off the wagon. He carouses with companions. He weeps. He falls in love in unrequited relationships. He regularly loses battles. He's deeply imperfect, which is, I think, one of the reasons why in contemporary readership, the response to Babur is so positive and so warm. He's so human. So in stark contrast to Akbar, Babur makes the case for Jahangir to be a legitimate king of obvious imperfection. Babur's writings offer Jahangir hope that a hero can emerge in imperfect form as a damaged man. So Jahangir in many ways then will follow the precedent of Babur. Many of the kings of the dynasty will have panegyric writings composed. This is a standard practice in pre-modern kingship and probably modern kingship as well, if we're going to be real about it. Jahangir rejects that. We see this brief period early in his reign when one of his courtiers, Abdus Sattar, will compose a volume, we call it the Majlis Jahangiri, which describes all of these evening discussions, and it's supposed to be a description of Jahangir's performance as the universal arbiter at the royal court. But the record shows that the conversations veer off course dramatically and regularly, and they devolve into how to use opium and gossip about the Shah of Iran, who is Jahangir's kind of nemesis, and he loves hearing awful things about Abbas. So the writing by Abdus Sattar will only last for 3 years, and when Sattar finishes, there's no further effort to create a panegyric on the level of Akbar's own. So what we see here is this appeal not only of Babur being an imperfect and brilliant king, but of narrating his own history. And this clearly appeals to Jahangir, who will use personal memoir as part of a larger effort to narrate his reign, to reinvent himself, which is clearly necessary to justify his ascension to the throne. Even as he confirmed through the device of memoir an adherence to dynastic precedents, even as he claims, and Jahangir have no doubt, he does claim to be divinely appointed. He reinforces that continually. And he commits himself to Perso-Islamic archetypes of justice, just kingship, in ways that were prodigious and public and commented on by outsiders. But in his memoir, he's writing simply. He's conceding personal flaws and failings. He publicly acknowledges his addictions in excruciating detail. Like Babur, he points out his own misjudgments on occasion. And he even kind of openly exposes the inconsistency of his flirtation with Akbar's kind of flamboyant claims, his pose as the authority of the age. Jahangir demonstrates a skeptical rationality, and I think this comes from Babur very clearly, and a willingness to accept their mutual flawed humanity. So Babur, this kind of poet warrior, would be celebrated for his particularities rather than his adherence to medieval standards of kingship. This is this power of memoir. It heightens the recognition of the individual personality, emphasizing, reinforcing the value of self-representation in what will become a canonical historical telling. And 100 years later, Jahangir is going to do the same thing to legitimize rule, to defend power. And just like his great-grandfather, he's going to emerge from the pages as this deeply flawed human being, charming, drunken, highly sensitive, sometimes cruel, deeply loyal to his dynasty, very, very proud of his charismatic lineage, confident in his right to rule, and always, thanks to Babur, and in complete contrast to Akbar, acknowledging his own personal failings as he makes the case for his own power and kingship. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Wonderful, Lisa. Thank you so much. It's such an interesting way of viewing how Jahangir is approaching, these ideas within the text. And then, as you say, it doesn't equate with the kind of visual projection of kingship, which is taking place in the arts, in the courts, in the audiences. And this is something I think which, across the board, during the reigns of all the individuals we're talking about, it's quite fascinating to see the projection of them and their notions of rulership within their histories, which is obviously a very particular, mode of presenting oneself, especially the fact that we have the two autobiographies and then the biography of Akbar, and how we have this projection of sovereignty in the texts. But then when we think about the wider scale of kingship and rulership and how that is projected in courtly audiences, in the patronage and production of the visual arts, in the construction of grand, architectural structures, throughout all the reigns that we're discussing, there is, I think, especially within the Baburnameh and Jahangirnameh, a disconnect in how people present themselves, and that, I think, that can be the beginning for a kind of point of really, Stephen, a beginning of a point of discussion. How do the different histories, I suppose, realistically reflect these ideas of kingship, because their audiences are very specific, but then you have this wider construct of empire, really, which then starts to get projected in other ways. And so there is a bit of a disconnect, I think, between them. So what can we say about that? How can we start to think about these ideas?
Yeah, I see especially Jahangir's memoir as very much a part of this kind of presentation of kingship, this kind of public face. There's no question that either of these memoirs are intended to be private documents. They're very explicitly public, in the same ways that the paintings are and that the Akbarnama is. It's so interesting, though, to see that Babur, not as surprisingly, but certainly Jahangir after, are going to reject this kind of courtly, polished presentation and choose to use their own voices. But it's all part of the toolbox, right? It's all part of this bricolage that they're all kind of patching together to offer an image of kingship that sustains them in the eyes of the elites and their rivals.
Interesting. Sue, is there anything you want to add?
Well, it's slightly on a tangent, but I was very struck listening to Lisa when she was talking about the reverence that Jahangir had for his father, which obviously I agree with totally. I mean, it's there throughout. And the absolute contrast between that and the relations between Jahangir and his son, who went out of his way to obliterate everything, every physical manifestation of his father. So the architecture was replaced by Shah Jahan's monuments in Lahore, in Agra, in Delhi. Even the paintings were changed so that the head of Jahangir might be removed and replaced with that of Shah Jahan. And I wonder how much our views of the different reigns are kind of subtly reinforced by the physical remnants of the architecture. So we have a lot from Akbar's reign. We have so little from Jahangir's, and of course nothing from Babur. So in a way, Babur is a very distant figure because he was distant in time, but also because there's so much less. And that's why the voice is so valuable through the Balabanlinar and the voice of Jahangir in his text. The question, if you can hear it, is how much the standards in the paintings of the Akbarnama owe to Timurid tradition with the red cloth and the yak's tails?
Well, those elements, of course, are part of the Timurid tradition, which were described during Timur's life. Babur, of course, didn't understand a lot of the Mongol iconography, and he describes when his cousin came from Xinjiang in 1502, I believe it was. There was a meeting of the Mongols, and they had the yak tails and yak tail standards, and they all of Chingizid iconography are of course are there. Babur himself, as I indicated, didn't understand most of them. And it's when he describes, as I say, his cousin arriving from Xinjiang, somewhere in the neighborhood of Kashgar, he talks about the Mongol ceremony that the Mongols had before they went off to battle with the Uzbeks. And he said, I don't really understand what's going on. And he describes the yak tail standards, of course. He doesn't talk about the red cloth, although when Europeans visited Timor, of course, the color of red was very prominently described. He himself, I'm not aware, of course, I'm not an art historian, but I'm not aware that in the Balabanlinar that he ever alludes to those things again. As I say, he really himself really did not understand a lot of these Mongol ceremonies, despite his close family connection to the Mongols. So that may not be a perfect answer to your question, but
no, it's interesting. Thank you.
And I think that's also quite interesting, because this idea that he didn't quite understand the purpose behind this type of act. But then when we think about the illustrated histories and what is being painted for them, because I don't know if this will show up, but I was just looking at this earlier, because we do have the Balabanlinar painting in the British Museum of him, shaking the mare's milk over the standards.
And there's one in the V&A as well. In the V&A,
yeah, exactly.
It has the same incident. So.
So the idea then that the images that were being painted were chosen for particular reasons. So there had to have been an awareness, certainly I suppose then by Akbar's time, of the importance of that ritual, even if potentially Babur himself didn't quite understand it, I think.
Possibly, what is, since I have art historians here, I have a question for you, and that is, one of the illustrations of Balabanlinar, which is included in the text, is a famous scene, which I put on the cover of the Brill biography. And the narration in the text is Babur returns to camp drunk on horseback. And I've always been charmed by this. And so the choice, in fact, I've always been interested in what images were chosen for the Balabanlinar, although I've never systematically gone through one after another, because of course most of the things are battle scenes. But I assume that those scenes were probably chosen to emphasize the Mongol background. But as I say, some of the other scenes, my explanation for why some of the other scenes are chosen, I just don't know. Particularly this one about him entering the camp drunk on horseback. I mean, what is the purpose of that? Why should Akbar have allowed that to be included in the illustrated version? Yeah.
It's interesting, isn't it? But the point is that they were chosen not by Babur, they were chosen by Akbar, because the translation from the two version
exactly
was done for Akbar. So I don't know. It's an interesting question, and I think one that should be, looked at in great detail. I don't know.
I've thought about it many, many times, and I did look at many of the other miniatures to try to get a better sense of what things were chosen. And most of them seem to be pretty standard elements. But anyway, but some of them seem just chosen for their curiosity's sake.
No, very true, very true. I had a thought as each of you were talking, and Stephen made the point, before in our kind of pre-discussions about how the Mughals, kind of need all the help they can get at the moment. And I'm just thinking about the, Stephen, you made the point that in the Baburname and Babur's reflections of kingship, it was about presenting himself as a Timurid and not as a Muslim. And when we have the progression into Humayun's reign, Akbar's reign, Jahangir's reign, I think it's safe to say we have that same idea being presented. We are looking at individuals who are presenting themselves firstly as sovereigns, and then very much reliant upon this dynastic heritage. And obviously a religion comes into play, but the idea that they were first and foremost of this particular cultural heritage was of importance. And just reflecting on what's happening today in the region, I wonder if you each could kind of say a little bit about just a little bit about that, how you think this idea, how strongly did religion come in? Because obviously today, certain factions talk about the Mughals as, Muslim and not in a positive way. And so how can we reflect upon their understanding of that and how they incorporated it into their rulership, in aligning with their dynastic heritage, I suppose? It's a very big question. I do realize that.
Question. It's a good question. I would like to say, though, that I think religion is embedded in every act and thought. I don't want to suggest that they're entirely separate places from which one draws references. But I also think that one of the things we need to push back on is the idea that an Islamic dynasty is inherently conservative and narrow, when in fact we have this extraordinary culture of fine arts, of poetry, of cultural breadth, of powerful women, many things that a contemporary audience wouldn't necessarily frame as being a part of the Muslim legacy. But this is very much at the heart of Islam through most of the pre-modern period and in much of the Islamic world today. So we have to push back against the way those questions are being asked. Yes, they were very loyal to their Islamic identities, but it doesn't narrow them.
If I could say something about this from another perspective, that is, I say, I spent some time, as Mehreen was alluding to, working on the study of Ibn Khaldun, the 14th century Arab theoretical historian. And of course, he portrays sultanates generally, and you could say that, the Mughal Empire is just another sultanate, that is to say. It's not, he talks about sultanates as regimes that are based upon power and money, right? And so it's not that he denies, that the rulers were, that he's describing in largely North Africa, were Muslims. They were, of course, Muslims. But he said that these rulers should, of course, patronize Islam, but they shouldn't pay a great deal of attention to the advice that they're given by members of ulama. And of course, when we're talking about Central Asia, especially the Central Asian background, the warrior culture is still very much a dominant culture. No doubt they're operating as Muslims to one degree or another. But once again, just impossible, I think, not to emphasize that Babur was a Muslim the way many people today are Christians or other religions. That is to say, he was observant in a formal sense. And beyond that, the only time he ever expresses real, genuine religious enthusiasm is when he talks about the Naqshbandi Sufis. That is to say, the only time he really ever shows himself to be a deeply committed Muslim, and when he's talking about, for example, Khwaja Farah, the famous leader of the Naqshbandi Sufis in the late 15th century. And it is very, very striking. And in that way, he's very typical of these people whom Ibn Khaldun refers to as sultans, that is, people who had come to power, were ruled because of power and money. Babur would argue, of course, that the lineage plays an enormous part of this, as it did, but that religious identity was not a dominant part of their rule. And so I certainly, these are not secular people, but they weren't. But in the case of Babur, you're also someone who's not a pious individual either.
Very, very true. I think that we are going to have to unfortunately draw this to a close. So I would just like to say thank you to all three of you for joining us, for sharing your expertise.